right. Thanks for joining us for class number 3. And we're going to continue looking at the fallacies. Today we're going to have Josh. And you might hear Grant in the background a little bit. He's going to hopefully interject if he has something interesting to say.
Doubtful.
Doubtful. So as usual, first we're going to say cheers.
Cheers.
And drink. Beautiful. No, we need the rag to wipe it, for each one.
No, we need some saltines.
Some saltines. No. All right, so just to catch you up a little bit, and I always think this is good for students to have a little summation at the beginning of class. And so, a logical fallacy comes in 2 flavors. It's either going to be what's called formal fallacy, which means that there's something wrong with the structure, right? And so let's say you had propositions that aren't linking together at all. So if I say your shirt is white, this is a chess table, therefore the glass is clear, that doesn't make any sense because there's a structural flaw there. There is no middle term. So every argument requires a middle term in order to be an argument. And so if you were to say something like, all dogs are mammals, all mammals have mammary glands, then you could conclude, therefore, all
dogs have mammary glands. Yeah.
And so that's you require a linking term for both propositions. So if you don't, that's called a formal fallacy. So for the formal fallacies, we're actually going to push that aside, and we're going to look at those whenever we look at the actual proper arguments. So we started with informal fallacies. So informal fallacies is when there's something wrong with the content, not so much a structure.
So that's where you have factual information that's incorrect.
That's one type of them, yes. And so last class, we looked at what was called the fallacies of relevance. So the group of fallacies of relevance are basically that each one of these type of fallacies, the information proposed is irrelevant to the actual argument at hand. And so, for example, the first type that we went through was called appeal to force. That's when you basically make some kind of threat. And so let's say you propose an argument. You say, let's say you're a communist, right? And you're like, we should have... Let's say, you're Joe Biden or whatever. And then when you do say that, and then I simply threaten you and be like, if you say that again, I'm going to punch you in the face. That's a fallacious argument because that's irrelevant to the argument at hand. It could be true that I'll punch you in the face, but that doesn't nullify your case.
Would that only work with threat of physical force?
No, it could be any kind of threat. Basically, okay. So if you say that again, I'm going to tell your wife what you did last night. That's also a threat. And then it goes through some of the very main obvious ones, like appeal to pity. You appeal to the pitiful state of the individual or whatever. So a lot of people use this. The example we used last time was in the healthcare debate. And so when
tugging at heartstrings and stuff like that. Yeah,
basically, you say, if you don't vote for this, you're just going to let this little poor kid die or whatever.
Yeah.
And you bring them out. The other ones appeal to the people, and so that appeals to all kinds of emotions, not just pity, but it's very similar to appeal to pity, except every other emotion beside it. And then the more common ones are like our argument against the person, ad hominem, and so when you're attacking the person, or you're using the individual rather than the argument that they're presenting. And then we had fallacy of accident, and that is when you take a general rule and you apply it to a particular case. And so if you say, for example, in general rule, it is improper to, shove a knife into somebody's abdomen, and then you conclude, therefore, it is wrong for a doctor to cut you open if you have cancer to operate on you. It's like, okay, you're taking a general rule and you're applying it to a case. These are obvious examples, but there's more subtle ones that happen with that,
So let me ask you this then. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, wouldn't that be a general rule fallacy to say, since it's always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a Nazi asking if you are hiding Jews?
If I'm using that as a general rule, as opposed to looking, if you
so
want
like as a general rule, saying lying is wrong, and then going into a specific situation where most people would agree that, like, we're not gonna run the person out of town for lying because they didn't tell the SS officer that
it really depends.
Goldstein was under the floorboards.
Once you get to like the moral discussion, it depends what you're using as your meta-ethical standard. And so if you're using consequentialism as a meta-ethical standard, I would agree. But if you're using some kind of other content deontological, or if you're using like the natural law theory, then I would disagree, because you're being philosophically consistent with the desideratum placed on what makes something good or bad. And so I think there's a distinction, because you're not using it as a general rule. You're not saying that as a general rule it is improper to lie. You're saying that there's something intrinsically evil about the nature of lying. And that's a very different claim, because you're not using it as a rule.
So that would only work, making the argument that, say, a doctor performing surgery on someone's abdomen would only work if you're making the argument that putting a knife in someone's chest is immoral.
Not just immoral, but I guess if you're making some kind of ontological or deontological construction of your meta-ethical, view, and then yes, you would have to say there's something intrinsically wrong or intrinsically evil about the nature of cutting, and that's a different claim, because nobody's making that claim.
Okay.
Yeah, they're using it as a general rule.
I would like to make that claim.
You would like. So let's move on, because we do got to get to the fallacies that we're going to look at today. The other one's the straw man fallacy. And so for the straw man fallacy, that is when you construct the opposing argument weakly so that you could destroy it. And we see this in political discussions all the time. Missing the point, or ignoratio elenchi, and that is when you have proper premises, but you have a conclusion that just comes out of nowhere. And so let's say there could be a proper conclusion in your argument, but you go to some kind of extreme that it doesn't, necessarily...
The sky is blue, and therefore clouds are fluffy.
No, that would be a formal fallacy. So it's more like if you were going to say, the example here, it says crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate lately. The conclusion is obvious. We must reinstate the death penalty.
Obviously.
That conclusion is kind of...
What other conclusion can you get?
Right. And so that's missing the point. The other one's red herring, and this is similar to missing the point, but the main difference is that for red herring, you diverge from the argument from premise 1 to premise 2, as opposed to having a proper conclusion. And this one used to have the English name of shifting the ground. So basically, if you and I are having a discussion, and then you just change the subject to fit the argument that you're needing to.
Now, is that the same type of argument as, like, moving the goalposts, or is that a different one?
Yeah, I think you agree to say that that's a red herring. If you begin just to change, I guess, whatever the goalpost or the limit of what the case would be.
Yeah.
But that would, because you're just swapping it for the sake of your argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're shifting the ground. And so, yeah, and that comes in a few different ways. So those are all fallacies of relevance, because the content that you give in those arguments are irrelevant really to the argument at hand. And so what the students really do need to realize is that they have to,
thank you.
Whenever you're arguing or having a dispute, more properly, you have to stay within the topic. Whenever you divert too much from the topic, you can very easily fall into one of these fallacies. And like what was said last week, there's no limit to how many fallacies you could do all at once. Like, you could do all of those all at once, right?
World record any % speed run. All fallacies.
All fallacies at once, right? You could do multiple every time when you commit a fallacy. So it's very easy to fall into one of them if you begin to divert from the topic or what the discussion was already presented. If you want to yield and be like, I agree with that part, so let's move on, that's a different thing. That's a different case. But if you want to change the subject with not addressing the argument at hand, it's very easy to commit any of those fallacies of relevance, because obviously the information that you're posing then is irrelevant to the argument that has already been proposed. All right, so this series for today is going to be the fallacies of weak induction. And so with all of these fallacies, it's kind of within the name, they're weak. The inductive arguments, if we remember, I think we talked a little about it in the first class. But if we didn't, we could talk about it right now. And so there's a distinction between deduction and induction argument. So a deduction argument or a deductive argument has where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, where you cannot conclude anything given those premises except necessarily that conclusion. And so, like the example of the mammals is one of them. So if you say all dogs are mammals, well, let's change it up. Say all cats are felines, and then you say all felines are stupid. No, I'm joking. No, just say say all felines.
Another correct statement. However,
yes,
logic
felines,
doesn't follow.
I don't know. What's the intrinsic nature of felines? I guess they meow.
Fluffy tail.
Fluffy tail. Okay, all felines have tails. And then you conclude...
Those weird slitted eyes.
Yes. And then you say, therefore, all cats have tails, or something like that. I don't know if the information there is completely accurate, so let's go back to mammals. If you say all cats are mammals and all mammals have mammary glands, and then you could say all cats have mammary glands. And that's a necessary conclusion. You cannot conclude anything else given that information, given those premises. Now, with inductive arguments, it's about whether the conclusion follows probably from the premises, and that's profoundly different. And so one is probabilistic while the other one is necessary. And so with inductive arguments, you mostly see that in the empirical sciences as well as the soft sciences. You're not having any definite answer. This is why, for example, if you pick up a biology book of just 20 years ago, probably 50% of the information is going to be outdated.
Yeah.
It's because the conclusions that biologists come to are all inductive. Basically, they're only probabilistic, that if they get more information to conclude something else, they're going to have a different conclusion.
It's not something where you can infer all of the information just by thinking through it. It's
Not
purely
necessarily.
observational.
It's observational, but it's also probabilistic. The nature of observational facts is always probable. It's never necessary. And so that's different than, let's say, if you pick up mathematics books of 2,000 years ago, it's going to be the same. It doesn't, time does not change.
I don't know, man. 2 + 2 = 5 nowadays.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, we could get into that later. But yeah, and so there is, that's the main distinction. One set of arguments, your conclusion follows necessarily, while the other sets it follows probably. And if it follows probably, the moment you get more information that could make your argument stronger or nullify or falsify the argument, you normally reformulate your conclusion. And that's the nature of inductive reasoning. And that's why with induction, there's progress, while deduction, there's not. Deduction, basically, once it's true, it's true. You can't progress further into truth. 2 + 2 = 4. That's simply true. And so because of that, there is no quality of progress with deductive reasoning, only induction. And so with this series, these are basically arguments that are weak versions of that. And so one essential quality with a distinction with induction and deduction is that inductive arguments can never be valid, nor can they ever be invalid, because validity necessarily pertains to the structure of the argument. And so when an argument has valid structure, even if in the end the argument is false, it does not make it invalid. It only makes it unsound or makes it false.
And that's for deductive?
Yeah, for deductive,
Okay.
right? And so if I make a false deductive argument that is also valid, I could say basically all unicorns poop rainbows and all rainbows smell like urine. Therefore, all of unicorns' poop smell like urine. Now,
I've not been sniffing the same unicorn poop I've been sniffing.
So now you take this argument. The argument is valid because the premises follow from the conclusion follow from the premises. There's a middle term, and the structure is perfect. And so you could say that's a valid argument, but you cannot say that's a sound argument because I'm using premises that are untrue. Mainly the existence of unicorns. I mean, they don't exist.
Hey,
and so,
what?
So and so that's the first and foremost a part of it. And so there's a distinction between valid and sound, or valid and true. Something could be valid and be untrue, and only deductive arguments can be valid. Now, there is no validity with inductive arguments. So induction follows what is called cogency. So an argument can be cogent or not cogent. And so how does it cogent or not cogent? So if it's cogent, it's strong. If it's not cogent, it's weak. And so there's a gradation to inductive arguments. Because it is probabilistic, you can be maybe like 80% strong, 90% strong. There's a gradation to the strength of your argument. While in deductive, there's only black and white. It's only accurate or it's not accurate. While in induction, there's a gradation, and again, this is why it yields itself to progress. So, and so with these groups of fallacies, they're basically saying that all of these fallacies are not cogent. They're very weak arguments. And now, in the end, that doesn't make them necessarily wrong, but they make them fallacious because you haven't presented enough evidence to support those claims. Right? And so this is, and that's what's really important about it. And so we see this happen quite a bit. And so that's all that fallacies of weak induction shows, that your argument is not good. Now, could your conclusion still be correct? Yes. And so can you go back and get more information to make it a stronger argument, to make it a cogent argument? You can. And that's something very important to keep track of these, is that just because it is a weak, fallacious argument doesn't mean you should abandon it. It should just mean that your argument sucks right now. And so
is that something that's common in debate circles, where you bring something forward that doesn't have like enough evidence to support it, and then everyone kind of like, shits on you and is all like, wow, you're a horrible person, I hate you, go die. And then you go and gather more evidence and they're like, okay, we accept you now?
I mean, academically, I think that's very common, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, people's first reaction to things, like, especially for academics, is repulsion. And so it's like, I'm already used to what I believe, and you bring me something that I don't believe. Show me more
high
evidence.
And mighty.
Yeah. They want more evidence normally. All right, so the first one is called appeal to unqualified authority. And this is a very common one that many of us actually encounter. And so with this type of fallacy is when you bring an authority that you and I don't know, right? So let's say that you bring it up as if that everybody should know this person.
Just the World Health Organization.
Or it could be an institution, you're right. But for beginners, just like an individual, right? Mm-hmm. And so you bring an individual in there and say, this individual said so and so.
My uncle Tommy said blah blah
blah.
Yeah,
that's a weak. Yeah, that's a weak one. That's an obvious weak one. Right? You say, well, mommy said that's not true. It's like, well, yeah, your mom's not.
Man, mom's never right. Mom's never wrong.
It depends who's mom. So appeal to unqualified authorities when you present an authority who really is not qualified to say anything. And this one actually becomes very dominant when you present yourself as an authority. And I think this is what happens more often than not, especially because of the internet and the wealth of information. There's many people who think of themselves as authority because they read a 10-minute
Facebook post,
right,
or a blog post from 15 years ago,
exactly,
and that cements their own ideas that they already had beforehand.
And all they're doing is regurgitating what somebody else said as if it is necessarily true. It's like, well, no, what if they have not presented sufficient argument for it, or
a complete disregard for just the scientific method as far as observation goes.
Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, so it's basically whenever you appeal to an authority that is not qualified to speak on the subject matter. So an example in the book says, Dr. Bradshaw, our family physician, has stated that the creation of muonic atoms and deuterium and tritium hold the key to producing a sustained nuclear fusion reaction at room temperature. In view of Dr. Bradshaw's expertise as a physician, we must conclude that this is indeed true.
Oh, hell yeah, man. That's third grade stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's not a physicist. He's just their family physician.
Yes.
So he has no authority.
No credibility in that. He's not running his own tests.
Right.
He's not. Yes. I don't know if there's a board certification for
right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times it's also social. It's how many things you got published with it. You become more dominant in that field, and the more that you know with it,
respected in it, stuff like that. Then, you have integrity.
Yes, yeah. So there has to be something with the authority that you're proposing. And one thing to always keep in mind, especially for the students, is that you always have to name the individual or the institution. You can't just say this broad thing scientist said. I mean, you can make anything up, right? And the one thing to keep in mind with this type of argument as well, if you're trying to do it a proper authoritative argument, is that there's been many things that scientists agreed on that has just been false. And it has been the case most of the times. I mean, you don't have like...
I mean, you can't blame them. They're kind of stupid.
Yes. I mean, if you think like phrenology, for example, I think that was a science that about 90% of the scientific community agreed on.
What was
so phrenology is when you had the skull of the person to determine the personality and characteristics of that person. So if you had like larger lobes on the sides, it means that you have a certain character trait, a bigger forehead or whatever. They had like all these, they had a very intricate science.
I think I've seen that referenced for like plantation owners in Civil War era. They would bring up like, my slaves have this physical structure in their skull, therefore they're more subservient than a standard person.
Yeah. And so it was a huge science that the science community simply agreed on. But that just didn't work out, right? You have Maxwell's theory of the ether that was competing against Einstein's theory of relativity. I mean, there's so many that you could list. You know, the plum-putty theory of the atom. They had creations of small creatures, just random creations of small creatures. There are a lot of these theories that many scientists kind of agreed on, but in the end...
Yeah, don't you know? Maggots just appear out of thin air, man.
They just dispute, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. Like, list the institution, list the person. You can't just say science at large. That doesn't mean anything. I mean, this word science in Latin just means knowledge. So you can't just say science said so, knowledge said so. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, cite the study, cite the person who did the study, look into the study, make sure they did it properly, stuff like that. Due diligence.
Yes, definitely, yeah. And being precise on who said the things that they said is what's important as well.
And most of all, look at blog posts from 15 years ago. They have all the answers.
Yeah. So the other one is called appeal to ignorance. And so this is when you appeal to an ignorant state, basically a state of not knowing, and try to either say, therefore, it is the case or it is not the case, right? Either affirmative or negation of it. And so like an example here says, people have been trying for centuries to provide conclusive evidence for the claims of astrology, and no one has ever succeeded. Therefore, we must conclude that astrology is a lot of nonsense. And conversely, if you say people who have been trying for centuries to disprove the claims of astrology, and no one has ever succeeded, therefore, we must conclude that the claims of astrology are true. In both cases, they're fallacious arguments, because you're claiming from a point of ignorance that we have not proved anything or disproved anything.
There's no knowledge of it.
There's no knowledge, right?
You can draw some conclusion, whether true or false. That's a fallacious argument.
Yeah, it is. And so you can just from a position of ignorance does not validate or falsify an argument.
The only thing you know is that you know nothing.
Yes, you don't know whether it's true or not, right? I mean, that's something that a lot of people have strong opinions about. It's like, well, you can have an opinion about it, but you have not proved it. You have not proved that it's accurate, nor have you proved that it's not accurate. You just say that, nobody has proved otherwise. And so it's just something to always keep in mind.
It's a good argument for why I'm immortal. I haven't died yet.
You haven't died yet, therefore I will live forever.
I am unkillable.
All right, so the next one is hasty generalization. And so this one takes a little bit of explanation because there is a proper generalized argument. And when we look at inductive arguments, we're going to look at all the proper forms. For right now, like I said, we're going to begin with the improper forms of argument. So a proper generalized argument is when you have a sufficient sampling, sufficient data to make a general claim. And one that you see this, for example, in marketing. People do this for market research all the damn time. If they're trying to get information, let's say somebody created a new channel, like Lifetime or Women's Entertainment Television. I don't know if we still exist, but it used to be.
I haven't heard of it.
Yeah.
I know there's still entertainment, but I haven't heard of women's entertainment.
Yeah, and so what they did.
2020, God damn it.
What they did is that they wanted to do market research on groups of people. And so who did they want to appeal to? Which demographic? Well, women. And what age group? I think it was like between 23 to 45 or something like that. So it was a large range of demographics that they wanted to appeal to. And so with that, they did a large study asking them, what kind of products they would want to see, because they wanted to rope in advertisers, right?
Yeah.
And so what kind of products would you want to see? What kind of movies would you really would want to watch? what kind of music you want to be played there, or whatever. And so when they gather all this data, they make a general claim that white suburban women between the ages of 23 to 40 like this kind of entertainment and like this kind of product in order for us to advertise. And you see this all the time. You see the same thing with country music television. They look at this, or they did the market research. What is it that, white people from these age groups that live in middle America, what do they like to listen to? What kind of, VJ would they want? When they show movie night, what kind of movie would they show? The same thing with the black entertainment television. They have BET. Okay, what is in general that black people that live in urban areas, and what kind of music would they listen to, and so on and so forth.
You're speaking Greek to me. Country music television?
Yeah, I know. You're too young. It is, yeah, CMT.
Is that like MTV or something like that?
Yeah, it's a country version of it. And BET is like the country, or like MTV, but except specifically for black people.
Yeah,
so
that's another thing I was going to ask. What the heck's a VJ?
So it's similar to a DJ, except disc jockey, so VJ is video jockey. Not anymore at all? Yeah, that's how old I am.
So they would play videos instead of music like a DJ would?
Yeah, that's what MTV started as. Mm-hmm.
Oh, so just like an MC for a certain set of time?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
That's how it began, because music television literally used to play music all the time.
It's so weird.
Yeah, and then they would have the different
just use
genres.
Spotify.
Well, nowadays, yeah. No, I don't even know
just
what
use Spotify in the 90s.
I mean, no, that didn't exist. I mean, does MTV even still exist? Do you know, or does it really?
It's still around.
Is it just movies and shows? Yeah, okay. Yeah, and so so they did all their market research for, what the demographic is and what they're going to advertise for them, and what kind of movies, what kind of shows, and everything that they're going to have for these people. And that's important, because then you can make general claims. Now, that doesn't mean that you're stereotyping. That doesn't mean that you're being malicious. It just means that these are generally true. It actually becomes stereotyping.
I mean, that's what a stereotype is, really. A stereotype by its nature isn't malicious. It's just something that applies generally to a group.
Right.
Most people tend to look at the word stereotype as a bad thing. I mean, it's just something that is.
Right, yeah. And it really becomes a negative thing is when you do the reverse. And so when you do it from particulars to a universal claim, that's simply merely making a proper generalized argument. It becomes a bad stereotype is when you take the general and apply it to a particular person. And so let's say, there's black entertainment television, there's kind of music, and then you encounter a black guy for the first time, and you're like, you must watch BET, don't you?
Well, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
That's stereotyping. That's a negative version of it. It's like
you must
taking
love
the general
fried chicken, right?
Right, yes. You're taking the general
doesn't?
You're taking the general claim and you're applying it into this particular instance that doesn't necessarily is not warranted. It's not logically warranted.
Yeah.
And so that's when it becomes bad. And so hasty generalization is when you make that general argument far too quickly, when you don't have sufficient evidence to make that. And so let's say this actually somebody that we both mutually know who was raised in New Hampshire. He, for example, went to school and he only encountered one African American person the entire time. Right, like he went to predominantly white school.
I'm racing through the directory in my head,
trying
to find who it is.
Yes. I'm not going to say their name out loud. And so,
is the New Hampshire part of who they are?
Yes, it is. Yes, yeah. And so when he went there, he didn't really, besides what he would see on TV, he didn't really know what they would encounter, right?
Please tell me he applied every stereotype to that single black person.
A hasty generalization is basically if you were to take that one sampling and you look at his behavior, look at everything that he listened to, and say every black person probably acts this way. And that's a hasty. You only have a sampling of one, right? Or let's say you only take the sampling of your mother and your sister and be like, women are a certain way, with a small sampling.
I mean, that's acceptable.
And so you can't hastily make these generalized arguments. You have to encounter them in a with much more sampling. So if you say you took a sampling of 1,000 or 4,000, then you can make a better argument of what generally these people are wanting or desiring or behaving as.
At what point is it not considered a hasty generalization? Is there like a percentage of the group population that's kind of
guess,
just like a point, or is it just...
I guess in this particular case, I think statistics does have a particular number for it. I don't know what it is, but if you ever do statistics or take statistics with, I think within the standard deviation that the formula that they use, there has to be a certain amount of sampling for the argument to be proper.
Okay.
I don't know what that is. Yeah, but that's just one type of generalized arguments. You can make many different types of generalized arguments. It's basically when you have a sampling and then you can make a claim generally that people or things behave in such and such a way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's important to make it proper always is to never make the universal claim of all. It's always simply say many or most, or just saying, this is normally the case, but never this is necessarily the case. Oh, right. The other fallacy is the fallacy of false cause. Now, this is when you make a causal claim when you only really see correlations. And it's very, this is a very, actually, I would say out of many of the fallacies we looked at, this many times is one of the least, I guess, purposefully done fallacy. It isn't as if people do this maliciously. This is just because many times they're trying to understand what the cause is, and when you normally observe something, there's just so many correlations that happen in a series of events that it's hard to just pinpoint to this one instance as this is the cause for this.
Yeah.
Right. And so
there's so much interconnectedness.
There is, yeah.
A holistic nature to it.
Many times there is. Like one example is, for example, when the Europeans first came to the Americas, they went to like the Central America area. And when they started to build towns and villages, many people started to get sick and die. And what they noticed was that people who lived by the swamps were getting sick more than people that weren't living by the swamps. So what they ended up doing was they actually drained the swamps. And so they made an inductive argument. They were like, people who live near the swamps get sick and die. So therefore, so it must be the swamps that's causing the illness.
Completely disregarding the fact that they brought over millions of bacteria that those people had never even encountered before and had no defense for.
The Europeans themselves were dying.
Oh, they were?
Yeah, the Europeans,
okay.
Yeah, they were dying. And so it wasn't until later that they realized. So what happened was that when they drained the swamps, it actually began to go down unless people were getting sick and dying. So it worked.
Okay.
But the swamp wasn't causing
some
the
supporting
illness.
Evidence right there.
Right, it was right, and so it was justifiable. Like, okay, we were successful, but it wasn't until later they realized it wasn't the swamp that was making people sick. It was the fact that there was mosquitoes living there. The mosquitoes carried malaria, and so they were stinging a lot of people, and they're giving people malaria.
Yeah,
and so that's just simply a false cause. You claimed that the swamp was causing illness. It wasn't causing illness, but it was correlative to the illnesses being caused. And medical physicians do this all the time. They're trying to find what the cause is. And so they're looking at many different correlations that, what did you do? What did you take? Maybe it's
looking
related.
At everything that the person ever did for the past, like, however long ago, months,
right.
years
and maybe many of the things are correlated to the death or to the illness, but normally it's hard to pinpoint what is the one cause. And so false cause many times is just you're not doing your due diligence, or you're concluding too quickly to claiming this must be the cause. But it's basically that looking at the correlations and trying to determine what the cause is, and you're picking the wrong one. You're picking the wrong correlation as the cause.
Are we still recording?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So the next one is slippery slope. And so slippery slope is when you begin to, when you have I guess, an outcome that you're saying that if you were to accept this proposition or whatever, and then these series of events are going to happen, right? And so you saw some people making this kind of argument during, for example, the gay marriage thing, saying that if you allow gay marriage to be permissive,
eventually people are going to want to marry children,
animals, and so on and so forth.
Buildings,
right? Yeah,
inanimate objects.
Yes, yeah. And those aren't necessary. I mean, you're creating a slippery slope. You're saying that these things will happen if you were to accept something. Now, that's simply a fallacious argument. It could be the case that it doesn't happen. I mean, it could just be the case that you just ended with that, right? And so that's when it's a slippery slope. Now,
how do you separate that from arguments that generally do, like, open the door, or at least put a foot in the door for things that could lead to bigger arguments?
Good, yeah, that's actually a good question.
Like in the instance of, like, the first thing that pops to mind is like Roe v. Wade. I mean, the Supreme Court justices at the time didn't think, oh, looking forward to 2020, what's going on now? They weren't even thinking about that. They were only thinking about what was happening in the present and what would have happened in the immediate future.
Yeah. And so the main thing to keep in mind is that there's a distinction between slippery slope and using a proper argument, for example, of looking at the desiderata for why they claim something to be the case. And so, for example, it will be a slippery slope if you were to say, if you were to accept abortion, next thing you know, we're going to have late-term abortion and then we're going to have infanticide. That is a slippery slope because it's not necessary that those things will happen. But it's not a slippery slope if you were to say the same reasons why you accept abortion does not deter me from agreeing that infanticide is in fact really not bad. And so if for example, you were to say, so what is the judgment for saying abortion is good, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the desiderata, one of the rules is that the child depends their life on the mother. The fact they're still connected, and so the dependence on the mother means that the mother can do what they want with their body to kill the child. And so this becomes a proper act for them.
Then you get into the argument of, well, even a 2-year-old depends on their parents for life. If you just leave a 2-year-old to their own devices, they'll be dead in a day.
Right, exactly. And so that is not a slippery slope. You're not saying that because accepting abortion necessarily means that you're going to accept infanticide, but you can say
your reasons for accepting abortion are the reasons that
I could accept
accept infanticide.
Yeah. And so that's not a slippery slope. And so you always have to be careful. Slippery slope is basically a fallacious version of a prediction argument. So prediction arguments can be accurate. And so, for example, most of us accurately predict that the sun will rise in the morning, right? Because you've seen it every day of your life.
Sadly.
Yeah, and so... So you can make an inductive argument in your head saying that it has risen every day since I've been alive, so most likely tomorrow the sun will rise again. And it's not necessary. A supernova could happen and the sun could just, explode and obliterate and kill the entire human race.
One can only hope.
Yeah, that's a possibility. So it isn't necessary, but you can make a proper prediction that it's most likely going to rise. And so what a slippery slope is, it's a fallacious version of that. You're having a chain of, a chain of predictions that aren't necessary. It could be the case that those things never happen. It could be the case it just ends right with one instance and the rest of the prediction does not follow through. And that's why it's a weak argument. All right, so the next one is weak analogy. And so again, a proper argument, you can use analogy. But the analogy has to have what is known as intrinsic or essential properties related to each other. If the properties aren't essential, and then it's a weak analogy. And we kind of talked about this the other day, right? And so there's this. I guess you could really take it. We could take it many ways, but it's basically when you take an instance that has no essential qualities related to the like instance, and then trying to say, therefore, it is so that this is true.
Oh, analogies versus metaphors.
Right, yeah.
Yes, okay.
And so we talked about that. So there was this one reporter and author. No, he wasn't a reporter. I think he was a contributor. But he also was an author of multiple history books and stuff. And so I think he's a professor of history, but his name is Reza Aslan. And he made an argument that was a very weak analogy. And so it was during the height of many of the Islamic terrorism that happened back in 2014, 15, and 16, right?
Yeah.
And then he said, well, more people die with household furniture every year than people die of Islamic terrorist attacks every year. So therefore, you should be more scared of your furniture than Islamic terrorists. Now, this is a weak analogy because you're analogizing a group of people with an ideology, and with an ideology that necessarily is animated because we are.
Yeah, they fall under
creatures.
Completely different categories.
Right.
Furniture deaths
that
are
want to kill you,
completely
right?
accidental. I mean, they're lamentable, but
right, and they're inanimate. I mean, they're just inanimate objects.
What are you going to do? Beat up the Amish
right,
sofa?
Yes. No. And it doesn't make any sense.
Sofa.
Yes.
You just take it home.
It's a terrible argument. It's a terrible argument because the analogy is weak. You have to make sure that at least the essential properties are related to one another. And they can't be the same thing, obviously. So when you have an analogy, you're relating like instances. And the word like means necessarily that it's exclusive to what you're relating it. And
the parts that you're trying to connect together are similar, although there might be other elements that are dissimilar.
Yeah. And what's important is that a lot of people use the word like to mean same or they mean as, right? And so I always find it kind of interesting whenever you hear a romance song which says, I want a girl like you or whatever. What you're saying grammatically is that I want a girl with qualities similar to you, but not you.
That's exactly what they mean.
That's exactly what they mean. Yeah, right. And so it's
they know what they're saying.
It's a silly way to say it. I mean, like necessarily is exclusive. You're saying that it has similar qualities, but it is not the same object as this. And so it's important to make sure your analogy is not the same thing. It just has to have essential properties that they both share, and that they're opposing to one another. All right. So that's weak analogy. So that's really the end of this group of fallacies. So for the students, I want everyone to focus on the exercises, work the exercises out. And like I said before, in the end, we're going to go through these exercises and just see whether you guys get the answers right or not.
Don't do it.
All right. Thank you.